Okay, let's do round 2 of human enhancement. So we talked about what enhancement was before, and then some kinds of enhancements. Today we're going to get into 2 separate topics, bioengineering and technological change. So this might be a bit of an oversimplification, but I like to think in terms of these avatars of various perspectives, right? So on the one extreme are the engineers that think that technology will be the largest part of solution to all human problems. Druids, on the other hand, think that technology is the cause of a lot of these problems, and so throwing more technology at those problems is only going to exacerbate them. I think we see tendencies in both directions in some of the readings and in society. So I like to just keep these avatars in mind, right? Like on one extreme, we think that we live in a gray and silver future, and the other one, it's a green future. Druids tend to think there should be fewer people. Our infrastructure should make less of an impact, that kind of thing. Engineers believe that technology will just solve some of these problems. So when you think about the previous discussion that we had with respect to geoengineering, remember we had these 3 rough arguments, right? Hey, it's a good option to modify the planet. We've already done that. And so we might as well do the reverse to try to eliminate some of the changes we've made. Delay tactics, well, we need to buy time because it's too politically dangerous to switch to carbon neutrality right now and economically harmful, so it won't happen. And then finally, we should avoid it if possible, but arm the future. We should have geoengineering capabilities available. There are lots of problems with geoengineering, and we talked about some of these, right? There are legal questions, unintended consequences. We thought it might be too cavalier, too limited resources. And we talked about this with respect to the eugenics discussion, about how once we start talking about bio situations and bio modification, we get the same old objections. Those are still there, but now we have worries about justice, distributive justice, or even just coercion, right, and exploitation. There's entire industries built around exploiting people that are poor and don't have lots of political power. The historical precedents we talked about, and then codifying contextual values. I went into some detail. So, okay. What about the arguments in favor? Do we get the same ones that we did with geoengineering? Not quite. I think we get 2 of them. It doesn't quite make sense that we're delaying the inevitable effects on the human bodies. Instead, we're making active choices. So you can still say it's the best option, or we need to develop these technologies so in the future we can address fundamental biological problems, assuming that we thought that they were serious enough to address and didn't have the technology. But also you'll notice that when it comes to biology rather than climate and geology, we know the risks a little bit better. It's a little more established. The technological risks are a little bit more well known. They're still very serious, and we should take them very, very seriously. But they're known. We also know that we can avoid or eliminate natural harms, which is something that I gestured at in a previous video that I'm going to talk about in the next section. There's a lot of bad stuff that happens now that if we were able to engineer, we could eliminate. And also, there's some benefits that we aren't thinking about that will just follow from some of this. So let's get into that next section so we can see how some of these arguments work. One of the big meta views with respect to not wanting to go down the line of human enhancement and human modification is sometimes referred to as the precautionary principle. And that is the view that when an activity raises threats of harm, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some of the cause and effect relationships are not fully established. Basically, if you don't know what's going on, don't take apart your monitor. Don't take apart your car. I say this as a person who often disregards this and often finds himself suffering um, because of it. So the precautionary principle says we're dealing with complex systems. The human body is a complex system. Don't break it. And I think one interpretation of this might be from behavioral economics, right? So in behavioral economics, people point out that when you think about any action that you could take, there's some really unlikely great outcomes and some really unlikely bad outcomes. But most outcomes will be somewhere in the middle. Again, here pretend that we're talking about human and genetic modification or human modification of more broadly construed. Most people overestimate the probability of good outcomes and underestimate the possibility of bad outcomes. So as a result, we don't actually accurately gauge the risk that we're undertaking. We treat unlikely outcomes as impossible. In fact, there's people that have used this exact principle to make millions of dollars. If you are willing to bet against the optimism of other people, you can make lots of money in the stock market and in other ways. So what's going on here, let's go back through this, is we have the perceived distribution of outcomes and the actual distribution of outcomes. And most people think that it's good outcomes are a little bit more likely to happen. I mean, you see this with even recently, pandemic preparedness. The United States really got caught with its pants down, but most countries did. Most countries did not take the risk as seriously as public health experts were suggesting that they should. Because we've had lots of reasonably good outcomes before when there were pandemics in the past. We didn't think that this was going to turn into one of the big ones. So that's the precautionary principle. People overestimate how likely good things are. So, and things are complex, don't break them. Don't pretend to fix all of them. There are people that think that that is actually not good advice. And here we'll go through some of the arguments why they would not think that. So imagine a druid was saying, whoa, let's be cautious here. This is a huge intervention, a huge thing to, a huge change to be making. And now compare that to what an engineer would want to say. So an engineer would come in and say, hey, actually, a lot of the concerns that that were being raised to prevent us from making these interventions into humans or into society, a lot of these are vague and unclear. So you're telling me not to intervene. Do you want me not to intervene in every case? How much knowledge do I need to have before you think that intervening is bad, right? Do I need to know everything, or just have a very big degree of confidence? That's related to the inappropriate burden of proof, which is that precautionary advocates tend to focus on merely possible threats rather than evidence-based. It's true that most of us underestimate risk, right? We underestimate tail risk, especially. But there is a way to adjust it, right? Like there is a way to think about it. There's also a vulnerability of corruption in the precautionary principle. I'm not that convinced by this argument. Actually, not that convinced by the vague and unclear one either, because I think there's ways around some of these. But the vulnerability to corruption, I think, applies as well to any principle. But to give the argument its due, if the principle is applied inconsistently and arbitrarily, then regulators will have way too much power and will be vulnerable to corruption. If you have to go to the FDA to say why your drugs are safe, the FDA has too much power and you might be able to corrupt them. Again, I'm not that convinced by this argument, but it has been said. And the last one, cultural imperialism. By not valuing natural risks, there's hundreds of thousands of people die every year from malaria. If we don't think of that as some evil, the argument goes, then what we're doing is saying that the status quo, which is really horrible for some people but fine for us, is good. We're taking our values and using them to justify why we should take a slight risk to help somebody in a dire situation. There's an alternative to the precautionary principle, and it's got a stupid name. It's the proactionary principle. And that is roughly follows from the previous lectures, right? So evidence-based outcomes are more important than worst-case scenario discussions. So make your decisions based on the evidence. Technology is an opportunity and a risk. It's not just a risk. So if you take it as an opportunity, you realize that all of a sudden the bias towards conservatism that the precautionary principle prescribes is undeserved. All interest holders should be at the table. I think this is the kind of insight that bioethics has produced that I'm glad. Centuries of suffering, we now realize that we need interest holders at the table. I don't think anybody would have thought about that in the 1800s. In fact, I didn't. And then a very simple prescription that follows from the rest: choose the actions likely to do most good for the most people, and continually assess and reevaluate. So we know that some of the interventions are going to be bad, and we will have taken some risks because we're proactionary, and some of those risks will turn out bad. So you assess, you reevaluate. That's supposed to be the alternative view from the precautionary principle. I think there's reasons to keep both, depending on the scenario that you're dealing with. So let me give you a particular scenario which deals with some of the stuff that we talked about in a previous lecture on genetic modification. And it deals with this discussion that I had about malaria killing hundreds of thousands of people every year. It's like having an airplane crashing multiple times a day, and half of it is filled with children. Half of the people that die of malaria are children. And so some people have said, Precaution is going to advise us to let them keep dying. But that is a natural evil. And if we have the technology to change it, we should stop it. And yeah, we do. We have the technology to change it. We have mosquito nets. We just don't have the distribution or the political will or wherewithal to do it. But there might be a more cost-effective way to do this. That is with using some of our new genetic modification technologies. What we could do is create a gene drive. And the beauty of this is you let the mosquito population take care of this itself. You cut out a gene, and trust me that it is possible, although don't trust the people that say that it's easy. So you take out a gene that makes it more likely that the offspring of a particular mosquito will be male. Let's say it makes it like 100% likely that particular gene will be present in all of the offspring. On the next generation, instead of a 50-50 breakdown, which I'm not sure is true for mosquitoes, but let's say it is, instead of 50-50, the next generation would have, I don't know, some higher percentage of male mosquitoes, and eventually it'll go to 75%, and then 87.5%, and then in the 90s, and eventually the entire population will be male and they will go extinct. So this is a suggestion put forth by George Church and others on how to use technology that we have now to save millions of lives by driving mosquitoes extinct. Now, keep in mind, mosquitoes are vectors, right? They aren't the ones getting us sick. It's a parasite that lives within them. But they are a vector that has been responsible for more human deaths than any other animal in existence. So if we could drive the Anopheles mosquito or some other mosquitoes extinct, the argument goes, then we should. And choosing not to do it because of some precautionary principle is culturally selfish. The counter argument is, well, there's a scientific one that you're creating so much natural pressure for natural selection to break your gene drive. So it might not work even if you tried it. Second, you're driving a species extinct without really knowing its role in the ecosystem. It could be a keystone species, and it could lead to the extinction of frogs and lots of other things. So that's the debate back and forth between precaution and proaction in a very real and currently being discussed case. Okay, so in the next video, I'm going to wrap this up.